Dust coated the hood of the Ford like talcum powder. Elias stared at the flimsy paper deed in his calloused hand. The banker had laughed earlier, a dry, rattling sound from the back of his throat. "You just bought 160 acres of concrete, friend." Elias didn't care. It was his concrete now. The air conditioning in the First National Bank smelled like ozone and cheap lemon polish. Elias sat in a chair that was too small for him, his knees bruised against the heavy mahogany of Richard Gable's desk. Gable was a man who looked like he had never sweated a day in his life. His fingernails were clean, perfectly half-mooned, resting on top of the appraisal file. $8,000, Gable said. He didn't say it as a question. He stated it like a medical diagnosis. For the entirety of the old Miller tract. "That's the cashier's check right there," Elias replied. His voice was gravelly, dry from the drive into town. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at the slip of paper sitting between them. Gable sighed. He leaned back, the leather of his chair squeaking in the quiet room. "Elias, I'm taking your money because the bank wants this liability off the books. But I want it on record that I told you this is a mistake. That land has been stripped. It was overfarmed in the 70s, sprayed to hell and back in the 80s, and left to bake for 30 years. The topsoil blew away before my kids were born. It's an alkaline pan. A biological parking lot. It's dead. Sign the paper, Richard." Elias didn't have the energy for a debate. He was 52 years old. His knees popped when it rained. His lower back held a constant, dull ache, and his bank account, after handing over that check, held exactly $412. He was a man cornered by his own life, a divorce that bled him dry, a contracting business that collapsed under the weight of unpaid invoices, and a creeping, terrifying realization that he had nothing to leave behind. Gable shook his head, uncapped a heavy gold pen, and scrawled his name on the line. He pushed the deed across the desk. "God have mercy on your back, Tom." Elias took the paper. He didn't say thank you. The drive out to the tract took 40 minutes. The pavement of the county highway bled into a chip seal road, which eventually surrendered to dirt. The Ford's suspension groaned with every washboard rut. Heat radiated up through the floorboards, baking the soles of Elias's boots. He rolled the window down, but the air coming in was just as hot as the air in the cab. It smelled of diesel exhaust and baked sagebrush. He turned off the main dirt road onto a pair of faint tire tracks that hadn't been used in years. Weeds, the tough, nasty kind that thrived in misery, like Russian thistle and knapweed, scraped against the undercarriage of the truck. Elias cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. He stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit him like a physical blow. He walked past the rusted cattle guard, his boots crunching loudly. He looked down. The ground wasn't dirt. It was a pale, grayish-white hardpan, spider-webbed, with deep thermal cracks. It looked like the surface of a dead moon. Patches of white salt crust bloomed on the surface, leached up by years of evaporation and zero ground cover. He knelt. The joints in his legs protested. He picked up a chunk of the earth. It was heavy, jagged. He squeezed it, expecting it to crumble. It didn't. It dug into his palm like a shard of unglazed pottery. There were no grasshoppers, no birds overhead, no smell of decay or life. Just the metallic, alkaline scent of baked clay. "It's dead," Gable had said. Elias threw the clod of earth to the ground. It didn't break. It just bounced with a dull thud. A tight, bitter knot formed in his chest. He had traded everything he had left for a graveyard. He walked back to the truck, leaned against the scorching metal of the door, and closed his eyes. The wind picked up, throwing a fine grit against his face. It stung. He was terrified. He was exhausted. But as he opened his eyes and looked out over the flat, white expanse, a stubborn, irrational anger began to replace the fear. The world had chewed him up and spat him out. This land had been chewed up and spat out. "All right," Elias muttered to the empty horizon. "Let's see who breaks first." The first 2 weeks were a masterclass in humiliation. Elias towed a beat-up 1980s camper trailer onto the property. It smelled of mildew and old mice nests, but it gave him a place to boil water and sleep. His plan, if it could be called a plan, was to break the crust. He figured if he could just open the soil up, let some oxygen and water in, the land might remember how to breathe. He started with a broad fork and a shovel. At 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, he drove the shovel's blade into the ground and stepped on the shoulder. The metal rang out a sharp, high-pitched ping. The blade didn't penetrate. It merely scratched the white surface, leaving a gray streak. The shock of the impact traveled up the wooden handle, straight into Elias's wrists and elbows. He adjusted his grip, raised the shovel high, and brought it down like an axe. It chipped off a piece of clay the size of a teacup. By 10 a.m., the sun was a white-hot coin in a bleached sky. Sweat poured down Elias's face, stinging his eyes and matting his graying hair to his forehead. His t-shirt was soaked through, clinging to his back. He had managed to disturb an area roughly the size of a dining table. His hands were covered in raw, weeping blisters. The skin peeled back from the friction of the wooden handle. He dropped the shovel. He was panting, his lungs burning. He stared at the pitiful patch of broken dirt. Beneath the crust, it wasn't any better. It was just compacted, lifeless clay. No worms, no roots, no moisture. He drove into town that afternoon for supplies. The local feed and hardware store smelled of sweet molasses, fertilizer, and rubber tires. Elias walked down the aisles, his boots leaving faint white footprints of alkaline dust on the concrete floor. He placed a heavy steel pickaxe, a box of leather gloves, and a tub of burn ointment on the counter. The kid working the register couldn't have been more than 19. He wore a baseball cap, pulled low, and chewed on a toothpick. He scanned the items, glancing at Elias's hands. "You the fellow who bought the Miller tract?" the kid asked. Elias pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket. "Yeah." The kid shook his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My dad says you're either a tax write-off or crazy. Says a bulldozer couldn't rip that ground. You ain't gonna grow nothing out there but a bad back." Elias took his change. He didn't smile. "Tell your dad to mind his own fence line." He walked out, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully behind him. Inside the cab of his truck, away from the eyes of the town, he let his facade drop. His hands were shaking. He unwrapped the new leather gloves, his fingers protesting as they brushed against the raw blisters. The kid was right. A shovel wouldn't do it. A pickaxe wouldn't do it. The next morning, he tried the pickaxe anyway. He spent 4 hours swinging the heavy iron head. The sound of metal striking hardpan echoed across the empty acreage. It was rhythmic, brutal work. Every swing jarred his spine. By noon, his hands were bleeding through the new leather gloves. The metallic taste of dust coated his tongue. He hit a rock, or what he thought was a rock. The pickaxe deflected, twisting violently in his grip. Something in Elias's right shoulder popped. A sharp, white-hot pain shot down his bicep. He dropped the tool and fell to his knees in the dirt, clutching his arm. The pain was nauseating. He sat there, hunched over, breathing heavily through his nose. The wind blew dry and hot across the back of his neck. He looked closely at the trench he had just dug. It was barely 8 inches deep. At the bottom of the trench, exposed to the glaring sun, were the thick, fleshy white roots of field bindweed. It was the only thing surviving down there, choking out any possibility of anything else, thriving in the compacted anaerobic misery of the subsoil. Elias dug his fingers into the dirt. It felt like talcum powder and glass. He brought a handful of it to his face. He wanted to smell earth. He wanted the rich, damp scent of topsoil, of microbial life, of damp autumn leaves. He smelled nothing. It was entirely sterile. A heavy, suffocating wave of despair washed over him. He was a fool. Gable was right. The town was right. He had sunk his life savings into a corpse. He sat in the dirt for a long time, the shadow of his truck slowly lengthening across the barren ground. He thought about walking away. He thought about leaving the keys in the ignition and hitchhiking west until he hit the ocean. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the temperature dropped. The relentless heat broke. Elias watched the shadows fill the deep thermal cracks in the earth. He realized he was fighting the land. He was trying to beat it into submission with iron and muscle, treating it like an enemy that needed to be conquered. But the land was already beaten. It had been beaten by chemical plows, by drought, by decades of neglect. He couldn't force it to live by tearing it apart. Elias slowly pushed himself up. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. He kicked dirt over the exposed bindweed root. He didn't need heavier tools. He didn't need a tractor to rip the soil deeper. The soil didn't need to be broken. It needed to eat. Elias didn't go back to the hardware store. He went to the industrial park on the edge of the county line. He had no money for commercial fertilizer. He couldn't afford the massive loads of synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus the neighboring megafarms sprayed by the ton, and even if he could, it would be useless. Pouring chemicals onto dead clay was like offering a vitamin pill to a skeleton. The soil had no digestive system. It had no bacteria, no fungi, no organic matter to hold the nutrients. He needed rot. His first stop was a regional craft brewery. The air around the back loading dock was thick with the sweet, sour smell of fermenting yeast and wet grain. Elias found the foreman, a burly guy in a high-vis vest holding a clipboard. "What do you do with your spent grain?" Elias asked. The foreman looked him up and down. "Usually pay a guy to haul it to the dump. Why?" "I'll take it. For free. Every week." The foreman squinted. "You got a dump trailer?" "I have an F-250 and a shovel." The foreman laughed, but he pointed to a massive steel bin dripping with brown liquid. "Knock yourself out, buddy. Just don't make a mess." It took Elias 3 hours to shovel the wet, heavy, steaming mash into the bed of his truck. The grain was incredibly heavy, soaked with water and sticky with residual sugars. His bad shoulders screamed with every lift, but he worked in a numb, methodical trance. The smell was overpowering, a sharp, yeasty stench that clung to his clothes and hair. He drove it back to the tract. The truck's rear suspension sagged dangerously low. When he arrived, he didn't try to dig it into the ground. He just backed the truck up to the patch he had broken days earlier and started shoveling it out. He laid down a thick, wet carpet of the spent grain directly onto the hardpan. It looked absurd. A dark brown, steaming stain on an endless white canvas. The next day, he drove to a tree service company in the next town over. "I need wood chips," Elias told the owner. "The ugly stuff. Pine needles, leaves, branches. Not the clean landscaping bark. The garbage. Take as much as you want," the owner said, bewildered. "Saves me the tipping fee." Elias hauled 3 loads of rough, green wood chips. He dumped them directly on top of the spent grain, burying the wet mash under a foot of coarse, shredded wood. Over the next month, Elias became the county's premier scavenger. He stopped caring about how he looked or what people thought. He drove around in a truck that permanently smelled like a garbage scow. He hauled spoiled hay from a horse stable that had been ruined by rain. He brought in bags of coffee grounds from diners. He scooped up cow manure from a dairy farmer who thought Elias had lost his mind. He layered it all. Manure, hay, grain, wood chips. It was a massive, chaotic pile of refuse, sitting directly on top of the alkaline crust. It wasn't farming. It was hoarding decomposition. The physical toll was immense. He lost 15 pounds. His face grew gaunt. His skin baked out to a dark, leathery brown. His hands were permanently stained, the dirt ground so deeply into his cuticles that no amount of scrubbing could remove it. He lived on black coffee, canned beans, and the stubborn, irrational fire in his gut. By August, the heat was brutal. The massive pile of organic waste began to cook. It generated its own heat. On cool mornings, Elias could see steam rising from the center of the mound. The smell was a living, breathing entity. Depending on the wind, it smelled like vinegar, ammonia, and deep, rotting rot. The neighbors 2 miles down the road called the county health inspector. A man in a white polo shirt drove out, clipboard in hand. He took one look at Elias, covered in sweat and sawdust, and pinched his nose. "Mr. Harkin, we've had complaints about an illegal dumping site." Elias leaned on his pitchfork. He was too tired to be angry. "It's not a dump. It's sheet mulching. I'm building topsoil." The inspector kicked at the base of the pile. A swarm of flies erupted. "Looks like a trash heap. You can't just pile garbage on the ground. There's no plastic, no metal, no chemicals," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "It's biological waste. Read the county ordinances. As long as it's for agricultural use and contains no hazardous material, I'm well within my rights." The inspector frowned, made a note on his clipboard, and retreated to the air-conditioned safety of his sedan. "It better not leach into the groundwater," he called out, before rolling the window up. "What groundwater?" Elias muttered as the car drove off. In late September, the first rain came. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a violent, driving thunderstorm that turned the dirt road into a river of mud. Elias sat in the doorway of his camper, drinking cheap whiskey from a plastic cup, watching the rain hammer his pile of refuse. He expected the water to run right off, just like it did on the rest of the property, creating flash floods of milky, alkaline water. But it didn't. The rain hit the wood chips and disappeared. The coarse structure of the wood broke the heavy raindrops, slowing them down. The spongy, decaying mass beneath absorbed the water like a giant sponge, while the bare ground around the pile turned into slick, impenetrable clay. The pile itself drank. The next morning the storm had passed. The air was cool and washed clean. Elias walked out to the pile. It had shrunk, compacted by the weight of the water. He took his pitchfork and drove it into the center. It sank in easily. He pulled back a thick layer of wet hay and half-composted wood chips. A wave of heat rose from the opening, but it was the smell that stopped him dead. It didn't smell like ammonia or vinegar anymore. It didn't smell like sour grain or manure. He dropped to his knees. He grabbed a handful of the dark, crumbly matter from the center of the pile and brought it to his face. He closed his eyes and inhaled. It smelled sweet. It smelled like a deep, damp forest floor in late autumn. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of actinobacteria, the microscopic organisms that give living earth its signature aroma. He sifted the dark matter through his fingers. Down at the very bottom, where the decaying pile met the impenetrable, dead clay of the Miller Tract, he saw something, fine, hair-like white threads. Mycelium. Fungal networks reaching down, dissolving the hardpan, slowly digesting the rock. And there, wiggling sluggishly in the cool morning air, was a single, tiny, red earthworm. Elias stared at the worm. His chest heaved. He swallowed hard against the sudden violent lump in his throat. His hands, battered, calloused, and stained, trembled as he gently placed the dark earth back into the pile and covered it up. It wasn't dead. It was just starving, and Elias was finally feeding it. By the following spring, the transformation was no longer a secret. The pile had become a mosaic. Where once there was only sterile white dust, there was now a 5-acre expanse of deep, dark, crumbly organic matter that felt like a sponge underfoot. But the land remained a contradiction. Beyond that 5-acre radius, the Miller Tract was still the same dead, alkaline graveyard, cracked, gray, and stubborn. Elias had stopped being a laborer and had become a conductor. He wasn't just dumping trash anymore. He was observing. He watched how the moisture moved through the soil, how the wind interacted with the edge of the pile, and which weeds dared to challenge the encroaching life. He didn't pull the weeds. That was the mistake everyone else made. He let them grow, then he would crimp them, knock them down, and leave them as armor on the soil. He was learning that the land needed to be covered, always. Sunlight hitting bare soil was a death sentence. He had started small, planting heirloom radishes and hardy kale directly into the richest pockets of the decomposing mess. They hadn't just survived, they had flourished with a violent, leafy intensity. The radishes were massive, their skin a vibrant, shocking pink, their texture crisp and sharp. But as the spring grew warmer, the local interest shifted from mockery to a quiet, uncomfortable curiosity. People drove by slowly on the county road. They saw the patch of lush, impossible green, thriving in the middle of a desert. They saw Elias, a man who looked less like a farmer and more like a scavenger, skin weathered to the color of saddle leather, walking his property with a calm, almost religious focus. One afternoon, a truck pulled up to the gate. It was a new, pristine Ford F-150, the kind that had never seen a day of real work. The man who climbed out was wearing crisp Wrangler jeans and a pressed button-down shirt. It was Gable, the banker. Elias was near the fence line, spreading a fresh lead of shredded leaves he'd convinced a landscaping company to drop off. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dark, damp silt across his brow. He didn't offer a greeting. Gable walked to the fence, his boots staying perfectly clean. He looked at the patch of green, then back at the surrounding dust. His face was a mask of calculated confusion. "I heard talk in town," Gable said. His voice was too smooth, too practiced. "People are saying you've got something growing out here. I wanted to see if it was just rumors." Elias leaned on his rake. The silence stretched thin, vibrating with the sound of a distant meadowlark. "It's growing, Richard." Gable gestured vaguely at the green, then at the vast, desolate acreage beyond it. "What are you doing, Elias? This doesn't make sense. You're working like a dog. And for what? A few bags of kale? It's not a business model. It's not a business yet," Elias said. He felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was dampened, cooled by the knowledge he now held. "It's a restoration." Gable let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Restoration? It's a hobby. You're fighting entropy. You dump all that material here, you're just creating a localized, expensive island in a sea of nothing. It'll be dead again as soon as you stop hauling trash. The chemistry of this soil is set, Tom. It's too high in pH, too saline. You can't fix it." "I'm not fixing it," Elias corrected, his voice quiet. "I'm just letting it be something else." Gable shook his head, looking at Elias with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I have a developer interested in the back 40. They want to put up a solar array. It's worth triple what you paid. Sell it. Walk away with your dignity before you lose your mind entirely." Elias looked at his hands. They were stained, broken, and strong. He looked at the earth, not the hard pan, but the living, breathing soil he had coaxed out of the dead. He felt the weight of the land under his boots. It felt like it was finally, after years of torment, holding him back. "The land isn't for sale," Elias said. Gable's face hardened. The banker's smile didn't reach his eyes, which were cold and predatory. "Everything has a price, Elias, especially for a man with $400 to his name. Don't be a fool. The bank isn't going to extend you any credit, no matter how many radishes you pull out of the dirt." Gable turned and walked back to his truck. He didn't look back. Elias watched him drive away, the dust plumes settling back over the hardpan. He wasn't scared anymore. He felt a strange, cold clarity. He was an outsider here, a scavenger in a landscape of giants. But he had something they didn't. He had time, and he had the patience of a man who had already lost everything. He returned to his work, moving with a rhythm that felt ancient. He was no longer trying to force the earth. He was listening to it. And the land, in its slow, agonizing way, was finally beginning to answer. The peak of the summer brought a heat wave that pushed temperatures into the triple digits. The sky turned a hard, unyielding blue. Heat shimmered off the horizon, blurring the line between the sky and the parched earth. In town, the talk had turned. They weren't calling Elias crazy anymore. They were calling him a curiosity. And curiosity, as it turned out, was a commodity. Elias didn't have a formal harvest, just a collection of crops that seemed to be vibrating with energy. He pulled the radishes. They were huge, glowing and crisp. He gathered greens that tasted like sunshine and mineral-rich rain. He set up a folding table at the edge of the county road, a simple piece of plywood on cinder blocks. He didn't put up a sign. He didn't need to. People stopped because they had to know. A woman in an SUV pulled over. She rolled down her window, eyeing the dark, rich soil he had spread on the table. She looked at the vegetables, which were vibrant and pulsing with life, a sharp contrast to the withered produce sold at the grocery store in town. "Did you grow these?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "Yes." "Where?" "Nothing grows out here. My neighbor has a place 3 miles over. He can't even get a lawn to take root." Elias pointed to the dark patch of earth behind him. It took time. She bought a handful of radishes and a bundle of kale. When she took a bite of the radish right there at the table, her eyes widened. She looked at Elias, her expression shifting from skepticism to something bordering on reverence. This tastes different. It tastes like actual food." Word spread. It wasn't about the volume he wasn't feeding the county. It was about the quality. People came for the vegetables, but they stayed for the story. They walked the edge of the patch. They poked at the dark, soft earth. They watched the worms move beneath the mulch. Elias wasn't a salesman. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders finally beginning to lose that permanent, aching knot of tension. By the end of the season, Elias had made enough to buy a small tractor, a second-hand, 30-year-old beast that roared and leaked oil, but moved earth better than any shovel. He didn't use it to plow. He used it to move the immense piles of organic matter he was now sourcing from every restaurant, stable, and yard in the county. He was an ecosystem builder. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep, bruised violets, Elias sat on the tailgate of his truck. He looked out over the tract. The patch of green had expanded. It was no longer just a small square. It was a sprawling, irregular shape that seemed to be bleeding life into the surrounding gray. He noticed movement. A rabbit, wary and small, darted out from the tall weeds at the edge of the property and into the lush green of his garden. A moment later, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its keen eyes scanning the ground. The land was returning to life. The food web was reconstituting itself. It wasn't a hero's journey. There was no grand victory speech. There was no sudden influx of wealth that solved all his problems. Elias was still a middle-aged man with a bad back, a failing bank account, and a life that was still, in many ways, in shambles. But as he sat there, feeling the cooling air on his face, he realized something. He had stopped looking for a way out. He had finally found a way to be in. He looked at his calloused, stained hands. They were the tools of a man who had chosen to stay and fight, not with weapons, but with mulch and time, and the refusal to believe that anything, even a dead tract of land, was beyond redemption. He wasn't waiting for the future anymore. He was planting it. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth, blooming greens, and the faint, sweet promise of rain. Elias took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, clean and alive. He smiled. It was a small, imperfect, and entirely genuine thing. The ground that once held nothing now holds the weight of a quiet rebellion. Elias proved that the most profound power doesn't come from conquering the world, but from nurturing what the world has discarded. He turned a dead, alkaline wasteland into a living, breathing testament to persistence. If this story of transformation moved you, hit the like button, share this with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over, and subscribe for more.